If you know NLP at all, you know my next guest. He is responsible for so much in the world of NLP, from the spelling strategy to the allergy cure, and of course, Sleight of Mouth. To fully articulate his contributions to NLP and coaching would take more time than we have. So let me just say, here's my very special guest, Robert Dilts. You are listening to the Essential Coaching Skills Podcast, a show devoted to uncovering the systems and the secrets that set the best apart, where you learn how to take your coaching clients to the next level, while you grow the coaching practice of your dreams. So sit back and relax, or sit up and get excited. Either way, you might want to pay attention. This could be important. Robert Dilts, it is so good to see you, my friend. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm doing great. I'm doing actually very, very well. It's a beautiful day here in Santa Cruz, and blessedly, we didn't have a fire here this year. They're farther away. We had to evacuate last year because the fire got that close. So
really, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Wow.
So I'm just happy that we got a nice weather here.
I'm happy for you. We are having a beautiful day here as well. I'm in the Hudson Valley of New York State.
Right.
Moved up from New York last spring during COVID, and we've stayed here. We had a hurricane passing through here yesterday.
Right. You had Ida just decided to visit. Yeah.
Yeah, that was exciting. And it was big. We had another hurricane like a week ago. Everybody was going like, okay, look out for the hurricane. We were all batting down the hatches. And Ida was like, yeah, that happened down in Louisiana. But then they didn't mention so much that it was coming here right next. And it was much bigger than Hurricane Henri was. But you know how those French hurricanes are. You can't.
Yeah. They're more nuanced, let's say.
Yeah. But it's a beautiful day today. It's amazing. It's just sunny. It's lovely. It's idyllic. Anyway, let's talk about other things.
Okay. We could go on about the weather, but
we could, but I'm not sure that's what people are tuning in for. So if I was to give a proper introduction and really read your whole bio, we'd be here all day, because it's a book. Your bio is a book. But you are gosh, it's amazing for me to have you here. You're one of my main teachers, one of my main influences. Oh, it's true. I mean, God, you've influenced my life big time. But not just mine. I mean, you're one of the co-creators of NLP. You co-wrote NLP Volume 1. You created Sleight of Mouth. I mean, there's so much that you've done. The NLP allergy process, the spelling strategy. It goes on and on and on and on and on. So I would love to ask you about all those things, but we don't really have that much time. So
you have to focus on the ones that have to do with coaching, I guess.
Yeah, maybe. But before we get to coaching, because I will get to coaching, this is, after all, the Essential Coaching Skills Podcast, and we do want to talk about that. And I know that you've been working in that field quite a lot with Stephen Gilligan, particularly like generative coaching things. So I'll definitely come back to that. But can I just ask you a little bit about Sleight of Mouth? Because
sure.
we have in common. I learned Sleight of Mouth from you back in 1987 with you and Todd Epstein.
Wow. Yes. Wow.
A long time ago during the master practice training. And then I came back to New York and started teaching my friends who were interested in, mostly other trainers for Tony Robbins, about it. And I started just doing these little informal trainings for people. But then later, when your book came out, Sleight of Mouth book, I was surprised that you didn't have those maps in there. And so
some are in there. I think some are in there.
Not so much. That's literally why I wrote my book on the user's guide to Sleight of Mouth, because I wanted to show people how you taught me
having all those maps there.
The icon map, because for me, that was how I remembered it, And so, so anyway, thank you for letting me write that book. And because it's gone a long way from my career, let me tell you. But how did Sleight of Mouth originate? How did you make that stuff up? And here's another question for you.
Yeah.
Would you do it differently today, knowing what you know now?
Yeah, well, those are two good questions. So where, I mean, I mean, in the book, I tell about the origin of it as well. I mean, partially, I was always interested in, language as a tool for persuasion. And, I got into NLP, in fact, when I was studying politics. I actually wasn't studying psychology, I was studying politics.
Oh, goodness. I did not know this. You're a politics major?
I was a politics major. Yeah, yeah. Actually, I started as an art major, then I switched to physics, and then I switched to politics, and then ended up in NLP or thereabouts. But yeah,
do you have a degree from Santa Cruz?
Yes, it's an independent major. I actually made up my own major, and in fact, NLP Volume 1 was my senior thesis.
Oh my God, I had no idea.
I submitted that as my senior thesis.
Wow.
So my degree is in behavioral technology. So it's a degree that anybody actually, if they followed the curriculum, could get. But I don't know if that curriculum still exists anywhere. Anyway, I was studying politics at that time when I was first getting involved in NLP. And I remember actually I think the first paper I ever turned into John Grinder, I was taking a linguistics class with him. Uh-huh. And I decided to use the patterns of the meta model on Plato's dialogues, the Socratic dialogues. And so was showing how Socrates used the meta model. Huh. But I also looked at other, political things. And the point is, I realized, okay, the meta model tells you some things that people are doing, and representational system language tells you other things. But there was a whole lot of things that people were doing, whether it was Abraham Lincoln or, I studied everybody. It could have been, Jesus, Hitler, all the people who used language to change people's lives and change the world. And of course, there was Milton Erickson as well. And I was just thinking, well, I can't get, there's things that they're doing that are not describable by a particular meta model pattern, nor it's more involved than representational systems. So I was trying to figure out, well, what is it how would I express what that pattern is? And then, of course, the big thing that sort of put it together was doing a program with Richard Bandler in Washington, D.C. in the early 80s. And he started going into this whole thing with somebody where it was, I'm sure, some kind of a teaching point for the class, but he started creating this kind of whole paranoid reality. He picked some poor guy in the audience and started saying, this guy's out to get me, and started making up all these reasons, and then he's asking the whole audience, help me, can't you help me? And whatever somebody would say, he would turn it around, and whatever they tried to do to change it, he would reframe it back. And at a certain point, I realized, I could actually follow what he was doing, and I would have been able to repeat it myself, which is always what Bandler and Grinder's first criteria for modeling was. If you can't do it yourself, you can't model it. You could describe it, but unless you can actually do it, you're not really modeling it. So I started realizing, I could do all that, and then I started thinking about, okay, here's somebody says this, you could say that, and that started leading to those sleight of mouth patterns.
Cool.
So, yeah.
And how did you come up with that, I think, highly essential icon representational map?
Well, so I think that the idea is that the idea would be each of these sleight of mouth patterns, you could say, is an operator on a belief statement. So, a belief statement being either, foundationally a cause and effect, if then, or this causes that, or an equivalence, the meta model, this means that, or this equals that. And so each one is an operator on one or both parts of that statement. And so the icons were just to sort of try to iconically represent what that operation was doing. is it turning it back on itself? Is it taking it in another direction? Is it going up levels? Is it chunking something down? Is it chunking something up? So that's how that came, was just try to take these patterns and visually represent those operations, and just thinking iconically.
Oh, that's great. And to me, it really is how I keep track of those things. So
yeah.
I think it's just absolutely brilliant work. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
For from the world for doing it. And how would you do it differently now if you were to be doing it differently now? I mean, well, you're creating it for the first time now.
I think in general, the patterns are still the operators. What I am eventually going to get a volume 2 out, and I've currently been doing a whole series of programs called The Magic of Language. So I'm sort of simplifying, revisiting, simplifying a lot of those. But I think what I would do is, one of my plans for the next book anyway would be to have, for example, jokes for each one, a visual example of how each one would work, so kind of take that icon that you have and say, well, if you had to draw a picture that showed what that's doing, how would you do it? And I think, always the big challenge with anything that's hyper verbal like that is that if you just get taken up into the left brain, that's not really where the action is happening. And that's, I think, where people get stuck, is they try to go up into the head and figure it out. Whereas many of those operations are not done purely verbally. They're expressed verbally, but the shift of perception, because what they all are an operation that shifts perception in some way. But that shift of perception is not verbal. It has other, to get to one of those reframes, one of these verbal reframes, you would say, I need to use whole other parts of my nervous system. Sometimes it's going to be more somatic. Sometimes it's going to be more visual. So I think I would probably try to integrate more of that into it somehow. Nice. But I think the patterns themselves are fairly, I still think I don't think I'd take any of them and discard them. There might be some that I don't know. I'm not sure if there would be things that I would add or not. Yeah, but
right. Well, I don't want to spend too much time on this. I could talk to you all day about this one subject, but I will try to refrain. But I will say I've taught it to a lot of people over the years, and for real estate people, I found out that they didn't really want to learn a lot of different patterns. They wanted to have real specific things to say. So when she says this, say that. When he says that,
right.
So I kind of dumbed it down a bit. I reduced it down to like 7 patterns.
Yeah, sure.
Slightly different icon arrangement of the patterns that were seemingly most useful.
Yeah, I think creating subsets for different types of things probably makes a lot of sense. Yeah. And that's what I was saying. In the magic of language, I'm reducing it. I'm taking certain subsets because it's particularly the magic of language is particularly for dealing with beliefs in challenging circumstances. So it's looking at when people are dealing with our current pandemic and other sort of situations and how that's impacting their life. What would be a subset that would be most essential for people to be able to get different perspectives, get outside of the box that they're stuck in, if you will.
Right. And by the way, I've often, when I do teach it, I always teach your original 4 patterns that I learned from you. And I remember a lot of the stories that you told. In fact, the one about cancer causes death.
Yes.
Your mother having gone through that process. And it seemed to me that it was true, if my memory serves correctly, that the one pattern that really worked most effectively for her was the metaphor pattern.
Yeah.
So about your cells are like a grassy field, and The sheep, yeah, like the white
Sheep
cells.
are the white cells that are grazing the grass.
Right, exactly. Is that an accurate remembering on my part that was the thing that was most effective for your mother?
Yeah, I think that's the one. I mean, it's always tricky to know because there's certain ones that resonate, but it doesn't mean that the others wouldn't. Maybe that one's it's kind of like that's the straw on the final straw, if you will.
Sure. Yeah,
so, But yeah, I would say that. Then I think that's probably an interesting point that for certain types of things, you would have, certain patterns would be more relevant. For example, in the other thing I'm doing for the volume 2 is finding a particular iconic character who represents each one of these patterns.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, if you take somebody like Plato or Socrates, in the Socratic dialogues, it's almost all counterexample. So that would be, you'd have this kind of Socrates as a counterexamplist. Mm-hmm. Whereas somebody like Freud was not a counterexamplist in the work he did. In his psychoanalytic work, he did what we would call metaframe. Mm-hmm. No matter what was going on, here's the reason you believe that. That's what psychoanalysis is.
Yeah.
You believe that because of your, Oedipal this or that or this.
Sure.
So he didn't really chunk it down or do other things. It was always that one. Somebody like Jesus, however, was constantly applying to self, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Why do you see the mote in that person's eye and you don't see the log in your own eye? Judge not, lest you be judged. It's all applied to self, which is very interesting. So if you find characters where their primary modality was one of these patterns. And, so somebody like Erickson was very interesting because Erickson was mostly consequence. Somebody says, I'm Jesus Christ. Oh, well, you must have experience as a carpenter. That's a consequence of that belief. I think I'm going to go into outer space. Okay, well, let's get ready, get all the stuff that you need to go in there and get it over with. So Erickson constantly went to consequence. And so it's actually rather interesting if you take people that we would recognize that have, that have a sort of, let's say, archetypal, we know of them, we know how we know something about them, and then they represent certain patterns. But then you can also see, as you were saying, why a certain pattern might have more impact for a certain kind of issue then,
I've often thought that the metaphor pattern itself often packs the most punch. That if you get a good metaphor that's really illustrative of your your point, what you're trying to say, people will often go like, oh yeah, I see.
Of course, Erickson did metaphor a lot as well.
He also did metaphors, yes.
Those two things. But yeah, I think that metaphor analogy is a really good one. Because as Gregory Bateson, he was one of our other big influences in the early days, that used to say, everything is a metaphor for everything else. So, because, in the systemic world, everything is a system, and every system is a metaphor for every other system. That's going to illustrate some aspect of it.
I saw a very interesting, cute quote today from Gregory Bateson's, whatever that book is called.
There's Steps to the Ecology of Mind.
That's the one. Yeah, where he's having a discussion with his son. Do you know this one? And his son says, "Why is it, Dad, that dads are always smarter than sons? Is that true? Dads are always smarter than sons?" And the father says, "Yes, it is." So that's always true. So, well, who invented the steam engine? Said, "Oh, well, that was." I'm not remembering the answer.
Fulton.
Fulton, yes, thank you very much. And he said, James Fulton did it. So, well, why didn't James Fulton's father invent the steam engine?
Very good.
It would have been a much better story if I knew all the rest of it. But it's a good story nevertheless. Hey, so Gregory Bateson was part of. Was he a professor of yours? Did you take classes?
Yes. I took ecology of mind from Gregory, and
That was a class?
yeah, it was a class. And then I also did an independent study under Gregory's, what he wasn't teaching it, but it was under his supervision. That was on. It was called Studies in Schizophrenia. So it was all we had to spend at least something like 12 hours a week with somebody diagnosed as schizophrenic or psychotic, and was learning about how they functioned. And
In what way did you spend time with schizophrenics? Did you
several
go?
different ways. One was volunteering at a local facility, locked ward facility. This was back, this was back in the mid to late 70s when I think it was Ronald Reagan was the governor of California and had more or less cut a lot of the budget to deal with mental illness. And so they were putting people in these for-profit things where they mostly just got chemotherapy. They would lock them in there and give them drugs, Thorazine or something.
Yeah.
But they would, you could volunteer and do things there to help, like I would go and take my guitar and play music or play the piano or something, or I would, go, but it was an opportunity to interact with people. There was also volunteered at another place that was, it's called the Soteria House, which was the opposite idea. They didn't give any drugs. That wasn't locked, but their view was that people who had these kind of psychotic episodes it was a way of responding to, some kind of emergency. And so if they just had people who cared about them there to support them,
Mm-hmm.
they would get better. So it's really interesting having these two completely different ways. Now, neither of them actually had any way of working psychologically with the patients, but so I don't know that either one was more effective, but it was actually interesting to have that experience.
Oh, yeah, which brings me to the early days of NLP. NLP seemed to really be derived from, Bandler and Grinder, obviously, with their work together, but it seemed like when they started modeling people, NLP could be applied to modeling golfers or modeling anything. It's about, the system that the person does to achieve excellence in whatever field it might be, piano or whatever else.
Yeah.
But they mostly chose therapists. It seemed like Virginia Satir, Fritz Perls, Milton Erickson, obviously, Frank Farrelly. So that NLP seemed to be a kind of therapy model. It seemed like to me that, when we were doing NLP processes, it was about personal change to become better.
I think in the beginning, because it was, because they were modeling therapists, they were always very clear that modeling was modeling, but they had just started that way, partially because that's how they, because Bandler had been very engaged in doing this work with, I don't know if you know the story, but Steve Andreas, who was John Stevens at that time, wrote a book called, I think it was called Gestalt Therapy Verbatim.
Oh yeah, I know that book.
He took transcripts of.
Wait a minute, that's Steve Andreas who wrote that? I had no idea. I've read that book like in college. That's amazing.
That was Steve Andreas, and he got into that because his mother was with Fritz Perls. He was, of course, also a psychologist, but sort of hanging out a lot with Fritz Perls, and so he did that book, and that was a very popular book. And this other publisher wanted to do the same thing. A guy named what's his name? He did science and behavior books. I'll think of it in a minute. Anyway, this other publisher wanted to do something similar, and so he had a bunch of tapes of Perls and hired Bandler, who was like a college kid, to go and do these tapes. And Bandler put together a book called Eyewitness to Therapy.
Uh-huh.
It was this publisher's science and behavior books, who published the first Bandler and Grinder books, by the way.
So Bandler, when you say he did the tapes, he transcribed them?
He chose which parts would go into the book. So he was sort of, out of all these many, many things, he was doing that. And then the same guy the same publisher wanted to do the same thing with Virginia Satir. And so he sent Bandler up to do recordings of her in somewhere in British Columbia, doing a seminar. And so, according to Bandler, he was just sort of monitoring the recording out of one ear and listening to Pink Floyd in the other. But at the end of this, whatever 7-day thing, Virginia was supposed to have, other people were supposed to be doing what they'd learned from her, and they didn't learn very much. And Bandler realized he could do it. And so that's when he started running these Gestalt groups up at his place where he was living, and had kind of reconnected with Grinder, and basically got Grinder to, Grinder in those days was big into, he thought psychotherapy and personal development was bourgeois. He had just written a book on Marxist economics, and he was a radical professor. And so I remember one of the first things I ever heard about Grinder was him organizing a protest of having students lie across the freeway in protest of the Vietnam War. So he was big into that side.
Wow.
So he thought this personal development stuff was petty.
Yeah.
And Bandler was very convincing, as you might imagine, got Grinder to come and just sit in on one of these classes he was doing with Frank Pucelik back in those days. And Grinder was really intrigued because he could see the power. This wasn't just people. He could see that you could use this for really big change. It wasn't just, tea groups or, these kind of things that people used to do. So he made his famous pact with Bandler, which was, he said to Bandler, if you can teach me to do what you're doing, I'll tell you what you're doing. And that's how NLP started. And it wasn't just a tit for tat thing, by the way, because Grinder was saying, I can't tell you what you're doing until you teach me. It's just like, I can't.
Yeah.
I can't outline a language that I don't speak. So I actually have to learn it first, and then I can actually tell you what you're doing. But Grinder realized that Bandler was doing something interesting with language. And so that's where it all started.
Wow, that's a fantastic story. I have another question for you, just because I've never asked this to anybody who would know the answer. Carlos Castaneda, were they interested in that?
Very much so. Very much so. They used to be, in fact, they would always have Richard was Don Gennaro and John was Don Juan at the beginning. And then they would kind of switch these different roles, where, one was the more digitalizer, if you will, which was Grinder, and Bandler was more the get out there and do something, make it happen. And so but they were very much into the Castaneda books. I remember Journey to Ixtlan was a big one that we all were reading. Their whole thing was being able to get to those levels without the drugs.
Uh-huh.
How do you get to these types of experiences without taking the drugs? Because I can guarantee you there was no, in all of those early programs we did, none of it had anything to do with psychedelic drugs, but it had a lot to do with
altered states
of consciousness. Altered states. And it was all about that. How do you get to these different states of awareness?
Yeah, questions some of us are still asking.
Yes. And still seeking. Yes.
Yeah, that's amazing. So, change personal history, is that something that came out of the Carlos Castaneda?
Yeah. Well,
at least the title.
Yeah, that's a good question. Change personal history also relates to the fact that they were really big into programming. I mean, literally computer programming. I don't know if you know this, but they were some of the first dealers of Apple II computers. I bought my first Apple computer from them because in those days, like 1975, all you had to do, if you bought 5 computers from Apple, you were a dealer. You got the dealer discount. And so they would get 5 and sell them to us.
Wow.
And I probably have a very early serial number Apple II in my garage somewhere. But they were into programming and a change history is a term used in computer programming. If you go and you update a program, you keep a change history, it's called.
Oh, well, yeah.
And I think it was that combination of that and the Castaneda's stuff that, made it resonate.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Well, okay, we have to move on. let's fast forward a few decades. And just fast forward one decade. Where do you think, in your knowledge base, things shifted from an early NLP being a change technology that was sometimes referred to? I used to say therapy, to coaching. When did it shift to like being, I'm going to do NLP coaching?
It started shifting in the 1980s, and I think that's when coaching started becoming more of a thing anyway. I know, when I started, for example, I started working with a lot of people in companies, and companies would even come and ask to help somebody, but they didn't want to call it therapy because people would reject that.
Yeah.
So it was, supporting somebody in making a change, where you didn't have to assume they were broken. You didn't, you didn't have to give them a DSM-3 diagnosis or something. And I think, NLP from its very beginning was, outcome oriented, even, in NLP 1, that's we'd say it's about getting a desired state and going to, putting all your resources towards getting that desired state. That's always the focus, which is really different than saying the problem is the focus and trying to fix the problem. Even though things like the phobia technique became popular because it was a fix-it thing. But NLP in general was more about what's your desired state, where do you want to go, what steps you need to get there, what's the strategy for doing it. If you look at NLP Volume 1, by that time, we were saying it's not just about, therapy, it's education, and it's about business, and it's about all these other things. But they hadn't worked out all of the different models and protocols yet for that. So, and even, I think it was probably 1980 that Grinder wrote Precision with Michael McMaster, which was a business, it's called the Precision model, was just for business. And what I think, so I first started using the word coaching in the 80s, and it became more and more, starting in the early 80s. I was influenced probably in that. And I know Grinder was as well, because Grinder had been I think he was even a ranked tennis player at some time in his earlier life. But Timothy Galway wrote The Inner Game of Tennis, and Galway started the whole sort of idea of inner game as a sort of beginning of coaching as well as a sports.
Right. Yeah.
So
that book from my college days, from the 70s.
Yeah. So I, it was very, to me, it's something that was gradual. And at the very beginning, nobody really even, coaching was all over the map of what it could be. And I think it's become much more, obviously it's become much more structured and more, organized.
Yeah, for sure. So what you're doing now in coaching, you and Stephen Gilligan started together the International Association for Generative Change.
Yeah.
IAGC. And you have a book, I think, that's just...
We do have a new book. And we're
generative coaching?
Yeah, it's called Generative Coaching, Volume 1. There's
Volume 1, yes. Very good.
Volumes. And this,
how many will there be?
There's going to be 4. Stephen is already finishing Volume 2. I'm starting Volume 3, and then there'll be... Oh. So they're more or less modeled after the modules that we do. So we usually do a first module in our coach training together. And then one of us does the second one of us does the third one, and we do the last one together. And that's sort of the way these books are also structured. Cool. But they follow, I think the important thing is that they all follow a basic 6-step prototype structure for coaching. And I think that's been something that Stephen and I, over the years, we started with an idea of doing generative coaching probably, 15 years ago, or maybe at least. And in the beginning, we were just sort of, we didn't have this 6-step structure yet, but it was through doing these things together that we realized, there's a natural structure that we're doing, even though we have different styles, even though we're using different kinds of methodologies and tools. We always knew where we were going, and we could work together because there was this sense of, well, what's this path that we're following, this path of transformation. And that's where, so all of these books are based essentially around the different ways that you can do these 6 fundamental steps that we would say are necessary for any type of coaching.
So what is, in your lexicon, what is generative coaching? How is that different from any other coaching that's out there?
Yeah, well, so the key word there, of course, is generative. And, probably the word that's closest to generative is creative. But generative also has a different implication to it than just any type of creativity, because there's you can have incremental creativity, but idea of generative is you're creating something new. So when somebody does something generative, it's usually, it's like disruptive. If you think of generative technologies, so if somebody's creating something new and it's game changing. And so the way we define it is that a lot of traditional coaching, which is great, is I'm basically helping somebody refine what they already know how to do. If you take, what does a sports coach do? What does a tennis coach do? You're taking something that's known, there's a way to do it, and you're helping somebody get better and better at it. Well, what about if you've never done it before? What about if nobody's ever done it before? What if you're entering into, it's just like we had in these past months of pandemic, you've got to do everything differently, so now you've got to create it all from scratch. And so that's largely what generative coaching is about, is it's, and very often what you're going to find, even in any kind of traditional coaching process, some things people will already know how to do. I mean, a typical question in NLP would be something like, can you remember a time when you did something like this before? Mm-hmm. And then you kind of use that as the resource. But if somebody says, no, I've never done anything like this before, I'm kind of completely new territory, then you have to, have a different way of approaching it. And that's what generative change is about. It's this idea of whenever you want to or have to do something that is unprecedented. And then, that what that means, and of course, what a lot of our steps are about is if you haven't done it before, and you don't even know what the outcome is going to be, because a lot of times, typically in a coaching process or even an NLP process, you get what's called a well-defined outcome or a SMART goal. Well, if you go, well, I have no idea what it's going to look like. I don't know what it's going to be like. I only know that it's that way. It's in that direction. I don't know. It's like if you ask Steve Jobs when he started developing the, iPad, what was going to be on it in the end, you don't know. We're going to figure that out. We're going to create that. Mm-hmm. So this is what the generative part of generative coaching is. Okay, what's the stuff that's new I haven't done before? I've got to bring it into some kind of an expression.
So would you do generative coaching with, like, let's say hypothetically a coach listener to this podcast had taken a generative coaching certification course from you, and we're generative coaches. If they set up shop and somebody, rang them up and said, yeah, I want to do some coaching with you, would they do generative coaching with whomever knocks on their door?
You could. I mean, so what generative coaching always starts with is what we call an intention. Well, first of all, actually, it starts with what we call a coach state. And the coach state it's a form of a generative state. It's an acronym that stands for getting your filters into a certain state to actually be able to do something meaningful and productive.
So what does it stand for? What's the acronym?
So the acronym COACH. The first C is to be centered in yourself. So especially especially would say in the physical center of the body, which is the belly center, not just in the head, but actually completely centered in the self, so that you're connected to, you're basically, you're present in all of your, I would say in all of your somatic presence, if you will. And then the O is to be open. So any performance art, if you've ever done dance or singing or martial arts, you always start centering because it's like, okay, I'm here, I'm grounded, I'm ready. And then you open. And so the opening is being open to possibilities. I've got to be open to, open head, open my mind, open my heart, open to, what's there. Then the A of coach is to be alert, attentive, aware, so now, so I'm centered, I'm open, and now I'm aware of what's happening around me, but I'm also extremely aware of what's happening in me, because awareness is key, right? If you don't have awareness, we know with this in NLP, if I'm not aware of my own programming, I'm run by it. If I'm aware of it, I've got choices about it.
Exactly. Yeah.
So that awareness then brings the possibility of new choices. Then the second C, the fourth letter of coach, is connected. And here is where we want to connect to multiple intelligences. So not just verbal intelligence, but, head connected to heart, emotional intelligence connected to belly, intuition connected to body, connected to earth, connected to what we call a field, which is the bigger systems that we are part of. So the sense of connection, I'm here and I'm online, all systems go. Then the H of coach is what we call, you can call it holding a space. Sometimes we call it hospitality, hospitable, which means I can actually hold the space for whatever is happening from a state of curiosity, creativity, and resourcefulness. So now it's like, so this idea of coach state is basically, I'm ready. I'm in the best version of myself that I can be in this moment. The second step, and this relates to your question, is, okay, so now we would say, what's your intention? Which is different than what's your specific goal. Mm-hmm. Because an intention is more general. My intention could be, my intention is to grow my business. My intention is to heal a relationship. My intention is to heal myself. So, and one of the things we do is we actually limit the expression of the intention to 5 words or less on purpose. Because if you start going blah, 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 mm-hmm. A, you're getting too specific, and B, you're getting too much up in the head. And then we say, in addition to these 5 words or less, what's your image? What picture do you have of that intention? And very importantly, what's your somatic model of it? Show me with your body what that would look like. If you couldn't say it, how would you show me with your body what that intention is? Even if it's an intention for my business, show that to me with your body. And that starts a whole set of, this is what, you're beginning a whole set of creative processes towards that. Then after that, so I'm centered in myself in this coach state. I've got this intention, which is a direction. Then we start connecting out to, we say, the field of resources. And the field of resources, of course, could be my own, but it's also anything with the idea of a field it's what is unseen and yet is influencing. So you can have in your field could be your teachers that the sort of tradition that you've come from. It's part of your culture. You have a family field. There's the nature is a field. So this idea of realizing a key part of generative coaching and generative change is that realizing that we are actually what Arthur Kessler would call and also what's his name? Ken Wilber in Integral Studies calls a holon. We're a holon, meaning I'm a whole person. I'm made up of other wholes, both physically and psychologically. So I've got a whole hand. The hand has whole fingers. The fingers have whole digits. Those digits have cells. The cells have molecules. But I'm also like a cell in a bigger system. I'm part of a bigger system. I'm part of a family system, a culture. So this idea that I want to really connect out to that whole field of resources. And then from there, the next step is you start moving into action. So start going towards that intention. And there's a whole different ways that you would coach somebody to do that. We do a lot of work with, you probably know about, the Disney Imagineering strategy. So storyboarding out steps. But then what happens, of course, is you inevitably and invariably start to meet obstacles. And we would say that those obstacles are an absolutely essential part of the creative process. Most people think they're a problem. We go, if you don't have them, you're not going to, there's no creativity going to happen. And obstacles are natural. As soon as I say my intention is to be happier, I'm calling upon all of the opposite forces to come and get me. And it's going to happen. As soon as I say I just want to, go towards this healthier me, everything that is responsible for getting in the way is going to start showing up. And what we would say is then we want to meet those obstacles. We want to transform those obstacles rather than try to get rid of them. We actually would say, especially when they're inner obstacles, that, we know from NLP, we'd say there's a deeply positive intention there. We don't want to lose that. There's a huge amount of energy there. I don't want to lose that. I want to be able to take all of that force and utilize it creatively. And this is where, we use a lot the metaphor of Aikido, right? I want to Aikido it. I don't want to kill it.
Right.
So that's a big part of generative change as well. And generative coaching is we welcome the obstacles. We look for the obstacles. We invite the obstacles, especially inner obstacles. But we would say, anyway, if an outer obstacle meets an inner obstacle, you basically have an unsolvable problem. If an outer obstacle meets inner resources, you've got a potentially achievable challenge. So you're always wanting to stay in this generative place. And then finally, what we would say is that since it's generative and you're working on an intention, there's not going to necessarily be ultimately an endpoint. My intention could generate, a dozen outcomes.
Sure.
So where we tend to say as well that at the end of any coaching session, nothing has actually changed yet. You've opened the possibility for change, but unless you put that into practice, nothing's going to happen. You've got this new possibility. So all coaching, any form of coaching, I coached my son's baseball team. We spent 3 times as much practicing as they did playing the game. You have to. So we would say, okay, at the end of any coaching process should be, what's your practice? What do you, and in fact, we would say, unless somebody commits to at least 30 minutes of practice a day, it's probably not worth taking on as a client. And if you're a client and you're not willing to practice at least 30 minutes a day, you're not, you're basically unmotivated to change.
Yeah, that's really true. As a former piano teacher.
Yes, exactly. Yes. Yes.
I can vouch for that. I used to always try to guess when a new crop of students would come in the fall, which ones would be really successful. And I'd look at their enthusiasm or, they're just, wow, they slept with their piano book. They just loved it so much. But what it came down to is how much they practiced.
Practice. Yeah. Yeah. We say knowledge is only a rumor until it's in the muscle.
Yeah.
It doesn't get in the muscle, it stays a rumor.
So just real quick about your acronyms. What's the crash state?
Great question. So yes, we contrast coach with crash, where we say, so coach is where the channel is open, right? We would say, which is that's a term that comes from Martha Graham, who said, basically,
I know that one. I know that quote. Yes.
It's a great quote. Your business to keep the channel open.
Yeah. It doesn't matter if you think it's good. It's not your not your job.
So
channel open.
Right. Exactly. Your business to keep the channel open. So the crash is the opposite of that. You could say it's where instead of centered, I'm contracted. Instead of open, I'm reactive. So that's the C and the R. Instead of alert and aware, I'm caught in analysis paralysis, up in the head. Instead of connected to all of these different intelligences, I'm separated from my field, separated from my head, separated from my feeling. And instead of the sense of holding from this place of hospitality, it's hostility. It's hurt, hatred. Those kind of H things. Now, and of course, that's a big spectrum there, because it's not that I'm just completely in coach or completely in crash. Mm-hmm. And this is where the whole coaching process comes in. We would say the essence of any coaching process, but especially generative coaching, is I've got to be, no matter what's happening, I've got to be enough in that coach state that I can stay generative, that I can, deal with what's happening. Now, it's not binary. It's not all or nothing. It's not I'm in it or I'm out of it. It's not I'm either in coach or I'm crash. So usually one of the first things that we're teaching people to do, and that we do, of course, with our client, is to calibrate where they are on a range, on a scale, where if you put 0 is I'm, somebody's completely out, I'm completely crashed. 10 is I'm in this, fully generative state. This is where, in fact, some of Timothy Galway's inner game ideas come in. He talks about being in the zone, a zone of excellence. Well, the zone is not a fixed point. It's as long as I'm in a particular zone, I'm going to have a chance. So we would say that zone is probably at 7 out of 10 or more in the coach state. If I'm getting down to 6 out of 10, half and half, I'm kind of half in there, half out, things are going to start to deteriorate rapidly. My capacity for generativity drops. Mm-hmm. When you get down to 0, there's nothing generative at all. You're just repeating, you're just repeating old survival strategies. So to actually be able to get to this place to do something different, to do something new, you need to be enough in those coach qualities, centered enough. I don't have to be 100%, but I have to be centered enough. I've got to be open enough. I've got to be aware enough. I've got to be connected to all these resources enough. And I've got to be able to hold what's happening enough. I don't have to do it perfectly.
Yeah, but it does sort of answer a question that I haven't even asked you yet, which is, being that this is the Essential Coaching Skills podcast, I often ask my guests, what do you think is an essential coaching skill? And I think that's the answer, is to be able to calibrate that and be able to get somebody to go from the crash state to
a coach state. Yeah, I think that's one of them. We would also say that we have this thing when we start, we say, okay, we combine our 45 years of more of experience, so our 90 years plus experience. Here's our most complex model, and we draw a big circle and a little circle. And so the little circle is the content, and the big circle is the process that's holding that. But we could say, in this sense, though, it's the relationship, so that in fact, what we would say that the key thing in any coaching process is going to be that relationship between coach and client. Without that, we would say that's the container. We talk about a coach container, which means that myself and my client, we have to have resonance between us, and we both have to be enough in a coach state that we can go somewhere. So I do think that there's an aspect, an essential coaching skill of connecting, because we would say that a generative relationship, one simple definition of generativity is that 1 + 1 will make more than 2, right? So 1 + 1 makes 3, 4, 5. So it's creating something more, just like hydrogen and oxygen make water. They don't just make a combination of hydrogen and oxygen. Something new comes out of that. And what we would say, and this is a very key part of generative change and generative coaching, is, we sometimes contrast. We would say in therapy, the answers come from the therapist, right? The client is broken. The therapist has the solution. I'm going to fix you with my, allergy technique or my phobia technique or something. In coaching, it gets flipped. The client has the answer. The coach is going to ask questions and draw out from the client. In generative coaching, we say the answer comes not from the coach or the client, it comes from the relationship. It might be expressed through the coach or expressed through the client, but it's coming out of the relationship.
Yeah.
I will say things that I would never say by myself. I would never even occur to me, because once I get in this relationship, something comes to me. So a lot of what we'll be saying and this is where generativity comes in. It's not that I think this, I know that, it's that this comes to me, right? Right now in this moment, this is what's coming to me. And it's coming to me because of the quality of interaction that we're having. Just like Mozart used to say, he'd said, I can't sit down and make the music, I can put myself into a state where the music comes to me.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why he was a genius, right? It's because it's generative. It's not like I figured this out by using all the rules of music and figuring this out from stuff I've done before. It's like, this is coming to me from this bigger field that I'm part of.
It strikes me interestingly, the early NLP, of course, and we were taught, everybody knew, rapport skills that you matched and mirrored in order to get to this state of rapport with the person.
Yeah.
But it seemed to be like from the outside in, that if I move the way you move and talk the way you talk, then we'll create this thing. And I've made you be in rapport with me, and but this seems much actually getting to the result that wanted in the first place.
Yeah.
By just like sort of opening to it, not trying to put it on, but trying to just.
It's what we would call resonance, which is different. Resonance is different because you can't have resonance one way.
Right.
Resonance is it's what is vibrating. I mean, literally vibrating in the physics, but it's what's vibrating between you. And so, what we would say is that it's. In fact, a lot of times when we're working with somebody, we will share that. Somebody will say something and we'll stop and say, when you say that, it makes, I get this feeling here in my body. And I'm wondering if that's something that you have too. Or when you say that, this picture, all of a sudden, I got this sense of lightness coming. So we'll often share what's resonating in us with the client. Not because you're looking for that place of connection, of resonance. So it's really different than I'm going to move my hand the way you move your hand. It's
right.
I would even say when you move your hand that way, this is how it influences me.
Right.
And so you're trying to get. We're ultimately trying to get from me and you to we.
Yes. Yeah.
And we would say it's that we is when you really are coaching. And I think anybody if you've really had a good coaching experience, you feel that anyway.
Absolutely.
It's no longer one of it's like my wife is a dancer, and I've done a lot of different kinds of dancing, but there's a certain moment when you go like in tango or something, you don't know who's leading and who's following anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right.
The dance is leading you both.
That's beautiful. Great place to leave it. Robert, gosh, I feel like we just started. I hope we can do this again sometime. I don't want to put you on the spot or anything, make any promises, but boy, I'd like to do this again sometime. Yeah. Okay, good. I'll hold you to that.
Boy Scout member, and I was an Eagle Scout.
You were an Eagle Scout?
I was an Eagle Scout.
Why am I not surprised? I never even went. I got as far as Cub Scouts and thought, I'm not doing that. I'm not doing that Boy Scout stuff. It's far too militaristic. I was more like John Grinder, I think. Anyway.
Although John was in the military, wasn't he?
Oh, was he? Oh, never mind.
John, you didn't know that? John was a Green Beret.
Oh, no, I did know that. Yeah, you're right. I'm sorry. Getting back to what I was trying to, if people want to get hold of you, Robert Dilts, how do they go about that? Not that it's hard, because they just Google Robert Dilts and you're all over the place.
Yeah, you can. I was going to say you can Google Robert Dilts, or you can go robertdilts.com or nlpu.com.
NLPU, yeah, beautiful.
Those will get you there.
All right. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, you're very welcome. But yeah, I do look forward. It's a lot of fun, Doug. I think everybody can tell that this is a joyful conversation.
Thank you.
Well, that does it for another episode of the Essential Coaching Skills Podcast. Thanks so much for being here. Hope you enjoyed this episode. I certainly enjoyed having you here. Hey, if you want more information about Sleight of Mouth, you can find it at essentialcoachingskills.com, or you might even check out sleightoffmouth.org. That's a nice website too. Thanks. Stay safe. Stay curious.